I think our contribution was immense. I think the 2,000 Machal who came there, who were experienced in every aspect of fighting, served to turn the tide. We were the tank men. We were the pilots. We were the artillerymen. We were also infantry, but they had a lot of good infantrymen. But we had to show them that to fight and die wasn't important. It was to fight and live, because they were prepared to die, and we wanted to live.
Israel, in the eye of history, an ancient nation newly born. The Mahal, a Hebrew acronym meaning the volunteers from abroad. From all over the world, they came to fight for this land. Others organized the immigration effort from overseas. Still others smuggled arms to the country under siege. Individuals from every background, they were united in a single belief that the Jewish people should at long last be allowed to have a homeland.
I think the greatest contribution was their moral support. The big problem we had in leading them into attack was to keep them from singing and giving away their positions. They never took anything seriously. They were marvelous troops.
United Kingdom, abstain. The United States, yes.
On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted to end the British mandate over Palestine and to partition the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state.
Abstain. The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
For the Jews, it was the realization of a 2,000-year-old dream. For the Arabs, it reinforced a grim determination to see to it that dream would be shattered. Despite Britain's issue of the Balfour Declaration in 1917 proclaiming support for a national home for Jewish people in Palestine, its policies in fact undermined the Jewish cause. Since 1939, the British had restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine. Exceeding the quotas was considered illegal, and those who were caught were detained and deported. But Jews, with the help of the Haganah, were determined to populate their newly won homeland. In Europe, tens of thousands of Holocaust survivors were left with no place to go. Waiting in displaced persons camps, they dreamed of the only country in the world that offered hope.
The Exodus, 1947, an old American Chesapeake Bay steamer.
The Exodus sailed on July 12, 1947, from a small seaport near Marseille. The British government was determined to see to it that it never reached Palestine.
It was built to carry about 30 automobiles and approximately 300 people. It never carried more than that.
True.
Until we used it.
Till we used it, we converted it to carry 5,000 people in Italy. On, like Murray said, on these planks. Every plank, every shelf was 18 inches. Every person had 18 by 18 to sleep in. If the fourth or fifth person wanted to get out, had to go to the bathroom, they used to pass a bucket in. That was the conditions on the ship.
The Exodus was intercepted off the coast of Palestine. Heavily armed British soldiers fought with unarmed passengers.
During the battle, I want to point out that there were 3 people killed, 125 were critically injured. There was a prolonged battle that took place for 10 hours of hand-to-hand combat during that entire period of time.
The crippled Exodus was escorted to the port of Haifa. Its passengers and crew, many of them wounded, were forced onto 3 deportation ships, the Ocean Vigor, the Empire Rival, and the Runnymede Park. But even suffering injury and death, the immigrants persevered.
As I was waiting on the line, I started to sing Hatikva. And if you can picture the scene of the people who were still on the Exodus and waiting on lines, sang Hatikva, and the people who were already on the first ship, the Runnymede Park, started to sing, and the people waiting up the gangway, and everybody stood still. And the Israelis, the Palestinian Jews, were telling them from the barges that the eyes of the world are upon them, and the future as to whether or not there would be a Jewish state may very well be in their hands.
The deportation ships were taken back to France, but the French refused to force the Jews to disembark.
And so they stayed on these ships for those 90 days, and after 90 days, they were finally taken to a British port in Hamburg, Germany, where they were beaten, clubbed, and dragged ashore.
After the Exodus sailed, and after it returned, I returned to the office in New York. We had a facility there for buying ships, for recruiting seamen, both professional seamen and volunteers.
The Exodus affair failed to stop further immigration. The opposite was true. It rekindled Jewish efforts to reach Palestine, and the resulting media coverage inspired worldwide outrage.
And then we formed a company called the FB Shipping Company. The B stands for Britain, and the F, you can use your imagination. But when we were asked politely, what is the FB Shipping Company, we replied, far better.
The situation in Palestine was becoming increasingly more difficult for the Jews. Both sides prepared for the inevitable conflict. Outnumbered and outarmed, a desperate appeal was sent out. What the new nation of Israel needed was a modern fighting army. The volunteers from abroad prepared to meet the challenge. David Ben-Gurion and the Jewish Agency continued their struggle against enormous odds.
The array of strength allied against Israel was overwhelming. And I didn't meet anyone in the military that felt that Israel had a chance to survive. It was a really desperate situation.
Major Ben Dunkelman served with distinction during World War II. He also had been to Palestine as a young man. For Ben-Gurion, he was the perfect choice to head recruitment in Canada.
Shortly after the resolution was passed in the United Nations and the violent reaction was made known of the Arabs, we knew that we were in for a tremendous battle and struggle. And I was looking after the end of volunteers.
I wrote to Lionel Drucker a long letter. It was dated, I think, the evening of the 29th of November after having heard the radio broadcast from the United Nations. And I said something like, "Dear Lionel, we have been organizing a group to go and fight in Palestine, and we shall be moving out within a few weeks or very shortly, and would he like to join this group that are going out to Palestine?" It worked out sort of ESP, because at the same time that I'd written him the letter, the same hour, the same time I mailed it, he had done exactly the same thing. Both these letters crossed mid-Canada, probably Winnipeg, at the same time.
After I heard from Arthur that they were organizing on the west coast something similar to what we were doing on the East Coast, I was called to Toronto, and at Ben Dunkelman's house, we decided that we would be shortly sending the first groups off to Israel. We screened them and organized them in Toronto, and I was asked to take the first group at that time to Israel. And we had organized about 30 people for this first group.
Major Dunkelman was one of them who was helping organize this function. We went to his home for a meeting, a briefing meeting about what we could expect fighting in Palestine. And others, we could expect nothing. And he said we'd have to take the guns off the dead bodies. He was pretty grim about the whole situation. But it was, for us young fellows, it was exciting. It was going to be a bit of history, and we realized what we're getting into.
The British restriction on immigration was very tight. The Haganah, the Jewish agency's underground army, desperate for volunteers, designed an elaborate charade. Volunteers would be given forged identity papers and sent to Europe to assimilate into the displaced persons camps. They could then enter as legitimate refugees in accordance with the British quota system. Major Dunkelman's recruits followed that route.
I was given a passport, a South African passport, in the name of Moshe Gruper, I think it was. I didn't know who he looked like, where he was, but it had my picture in it.
I was given a passport with a wife. My name was Chaim Nowitzki, and her name was Sarah Nowitzki. I was supposed to have been from Leeds in England. Of course, I didn't have an English accent, but nobody would know the difference. The only thing is I had a 32-year-old wife, and here I was a 22-year-old guy, and she was very interested in me, and I wasn't, because there was other 18-year-old girls on board the ship. So I had quite a job keeping her away from me.
We got to Haifa, and we started to disembark. And again, it was a long hallway, and there was customs and immigration and all kinds of tables all the way through. And we were told, don't forget what your name is. Use the right name. Use the name on the passport. I was worried because I had no idea what a South African accent sounded like. Anyhow, there were British officers there, all the way down the line. And every place I went, I handed them the passport. What's your name? Moshe Gruper, Moshe Gruper, Moshe Gruper, Moshe Gruper, Moshe Gruper. Finally got to the very end, and there was a little man there, and he said, and signed saying Jewish Agency. And he said, what's your name? And I said, Moshe Gruper. He said, no, what's your real name? This is a Jewish Agency. No, Moshe Gruper.
Many foreign volunteers were not Jewish. What motivated them were the haunting memories of the Nazi death camps they had witnessed during the last days of the war in Europe.
There's no sense in me dwelling on what we saw, because it was just unbelievable. I still don't believe it to this day. And I thought at the time that there was just no way that any member of any human race can treat another person of the human race this way, no matter what their cause or provocation. And perhaps it's a little bit of making amends. It certainly wasn't because of the pay. We weren't highly paid out there. But that was basically the idea behind it. And that's how I ended up in Israel in 1948.
May I say that you have not only honored your own name, honored the name of your parents, honored the name of the province from which you have come, honored the name of your country, but you
George Buzz Burling, the Canadian World War II flying ace with 31 enemy planes to his credit, let it be known that he wanted to fight for the fledgling Jewish Air Force. To Ben Dunkelman, this meant the Haganah was on the verge of scoring its biggest recruitment victory yet.
And I told him, I said, Buzz, we don't have anything. We don't have planes. We maybe have a few Piper Cubs. But we don't really, and we can't pay you. And he said, doesn't matter. I said, well, what did it do? He said, if you give me permission, he said, I'll get together a squadron of Canadians and I'll go to Malta, visit my Royal Air Force friends there and steal a squadron of Spits and take them over to Israel. And I asked for permission to do it from the Jewish agency, but they wouldn't give me permission.
Pilot Max Brown, known as a skilled machinist, was recruited in Toronto. He was asked to set up a machine gun manufacturing plant at his shop at Bay and Wellesley Streets. On February 24th, 1947, Brown and his driver drove to Niagara Falls with gun parts concealed in their car.
We arrived at the border here. We stopped by the custom inspector, who went around to the driver's side, and he asked my driver, who was supposed to have been well rehearsed on what he was going to say, and he asked the driver, how long are you going over for, and what is the purpose of your trip? And the driver answered, oh, I'm just going over to take this man across, and then I'm going right back. So the custom inspector says, well, he leaned a little further in the window and asked him, how long are you going over for? I said, I'm going over for 3 days. What are you going over for? Just to visit my girlfriend. He said, you must be a pretty important man if he's going over to make a trip special to take you across. And he came around to my side, and he asked me to, if I would step out of the car. And he leaned in, and I saw him put his hand under the seat, and he came right across the gun parts, and my heart sort of went down to the pit of my stomach because I knew that we were in trouble.
Brown was arrested, his operations shut down, and his blueprints confiscated. After his trial, he headed for Israel, finally setting up the machine gun plant there, the first on home soil. It barely began to meet the need. At the 11th hour, Czechoslovakia agreed to supply arms and ammunition. Now planes were needed urgently to airlift the supplies to Israel. On July 12, 1948, 4 B-17s, Flying Fortresses, took off from the U.S. for Czechoslovakia.
I had never flown a B-17, and you know that's a totally illegal thing. You're supposed to be checked out in an airplane. There are fuel systems, gas systems, all sorts of things, and you don't really have any opportunity to do it. But they were desperate.
He came out, and he says, is there a flight engineer in this group? And something I learned in the American Army, never to volunteer, and I was tired. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, so I did it. I stuck my hand up.
The flight crews were hastily assembled. The planes were not equipped for overseas flight, and there was no time for safety checks. Unfortunately, Schindler's plane ran into bad weather and mechanical trouble, forcing a landing in Halifax.
We were approached by a customs official, and I explained to him that this was an emergency, that we were short of fuel, that the weather was bad, that my radios had gone out, and that we'd been on a routine navigational training flight out of New York, and that all I wanted was permission to take off and to fly back to New York. He said, fine, told me there was a $100 fine for this, which I said I would be glad to pay, and he started making out the necessary documents. We were in the customs office at that time, and there was a radio playing. It was already quite late in the evening, and the voice of Lowell Thomas came on, and his lead story was this B-17 presumably going to Palestine, who had just flown out of New York that day. I remember the man as he was writing, and his hand just stopped. You know, and he looked up and he looked at me, he looked at the paper, he took the paper and he said, I'll be back in just a minute. When the interrogation was over, as I was there leaning on a counter, and the men who had interrogated me passed, one of them said in a low voice and aside, you're doing fine, kid. Just stick to your story. The following morning, my story was in shreds because they found guns stored into the wings of the aircraft. Well, it was small arms, but nevertheless, it was obvious that, and also other things that they found there that indicated that I was not on a routine navigational training flight.
Nor was it a routine flight for the remaining flying fortresses. They flew in formation over the Atlantic, following the lead plane because it was the only one with navigational equipment. Back in Halifax, Schindler made a final call to Haganah headquarters. He was instructed to continue his flight, that special arrangements had been made at the Azores where he would need to refuel. The next day, Schindler met with Base Commander Lewis and asked for fuel to fly back to the United States.
He, knowingly or unknowingly, and probably knowingly, had permitted the fuel to be given to me in imperial gallons, whereas the manual I showed him, as far as the requirements of the aircraft is concerned, were in American gallons. So there was about a 20% differential.
All Schindler needed now was the opportunity to slip away from the plane sent to escort him back to the United States.
I had planned to leave at dusk and to avoid the plane by turning off our lights and taking advantage of our camouflage and staying over the heavily wooded areas at a very low altitude, heading in the general direction of Boston. And when night fell, and I was quite certain that I would not be seen, I would turn toward the Azores.
We landed there and expected to refuel and take off. Now here I am, I'm all excited as well as exhausted. I've never been to Israel or Palestine. I was looking forward to it, and I felt, wow, we've really accomplished. Now all we have to do is refuel, and we're on the way. Forget it.
They knew who we were, and that we're being apprehended, and that we should make ourselves comfortable because the airplane wasn't going anywhere.
Over the Atlantic, one of the B-17s was in trouble. Losing sight of the lead plane, it was left to fly blindly across the vast expanse of ocean.
I tried to build a drift meter on the plexiglass floor of the nose of the plane. Now, the plexiglass floor had been put in during World War II to hold these very large photo reconnaissance cameras. Now, while I was working on the floor, I didn't realize the plexiglass had become crazed, and that time I weighed about 160 pounds, almost half of what I do now, and the floor still gave way, and I caught myself on the bombardier's gun, worked my hands up into the bombardier's seat, locked them there. I was out of the body, my almost entire body was out of the plane. The only part that was left in the plane was my shoulders, my arms, and my head. The rest of my body from here on out, down was out of the plane. Then one of the radio men who'd come forward and tried to pull my belt up, reached down, and his watch was sucked off his hands. And at that point, he didn't want to get close to me. The rest of the men were afraid to get close to me because if they did grab a hold of me and I fell, they would go with me. The co-pilot, however, tore off an oxygen hose that ran along the bulkhead of the nose of the plane and dropped it into the plexiglass hole. And at that point, they made a loop out of it, and I lifted up my leg, and they put it under my crotch and pulled me back into the plane. I'd been out approximately 20 minutes by that time. I had been bleeding internally from hemorrhaging, completely worn out, tired, and made my way to the back of the plane, told them I would go to sleep and to wake me up when it became dark. Well, I think everyone was rather somber. They joked, one fellow said, you probably crapped in your pants. I said, don't be ridiculous. I didn't crap in my pants. And sure enough, when I went in the back, I had. And evidently, the entire body of mine had gone limp. Every muscle had gone limp. And all the energy was concentrated right in my two hands to hold on.
The arrival of the 3 B-17s in Czechoslovakia meant that the Israeli Air Force was becoming a reality. Now Italy had agreed to provide a training ground at Erbe, a small airfield just outside Rome. With planes in place, Buzz Berling received the green light to go overseas. In spite of the Haganah's effort to move men and arms quietly, the flamboyant Berling, in his characteristic manner, was unable to keep the news from the press. His first stop on the way to Israel was to be Italy.
The chief flying instructor, he told me that when Berling was coming in, that he was just making a a normal landing, and a sheet of flame broke out the side of the aircraft, and they went in on the wing, and he and this chap with him, Lenny Cohen, they don't think they were even hurt, really. They were knocked out. But there was no firefighting equipment, and they burned to death, unconscious, fortunately, inside the airplane.
He was ferrying the plane to Israel. I believe it was a Norseman, a single-engine plane, and a very mysterious explosion occurred upon landing, and he was killed. A real tragedy.
It was said that there were really two Buzz Burlings. One, the friendly, lanky farm boy from Verdun, Quebec. The other was a complex, flamboyant, unpredictable professional. Pilots of his caliber were rare, with a flying style that was always on the edge.
But you needed this hell for leather attitude to want to be a pilot, like every pilot everywhere in the world. You've got to be a bit of a nutcase to want to do this thing. You're leaving your natural element, which is the ground. And you're getting up there in the sky. If you want to do that and do it regularly, then you've got to be slightly crazy.
Buzz, I think, was a combination of a top gunner and a top pilot. And he was tops in both regards, and that's why I don't believe that that was an accident that he was killed, and I think it was sabotage.
I don't know. My experience in life is that accidents do happen, and it could have been an accident. But there's no knowing.
George Buzz Burling never reached Palestine, but Israel remembers him as a hero, one of the first volunteers to die for the new state.
New days of crisis in Palestine.
Gradually, the foreign volunteers began to arrive, but Ben Dunkelman was different from most. He brought a deeply rooted commitment nurtured since he was first there as a young man, working the desert farms with Jewish pioneers. But he also brought the battle-hardened skills of a seasoned fighter.
I always seemed to be drawn towards Palestine in the early days. I can recall the first time I came to Israel, we passed Israel over the Sinai Desert. It was quite a trip. A sandstorm was blowing, the train was stalled, and it was a very trying trip. But I think I had the greatest feeling of come over me of relief and happiness that I've ever had in my life. I all of a sudden felt that something great was happening to me and I was coming home.
The foreign volunteers who arrived were a mixed lot. Some were trained fighters, some veterans of the Second World War. Others had little more to offer than enthusiasm.
They're fresh, they've never been in action before, never heard a shot fired in their life before. And I was crawling from one group to the other to kind of take it easy, it's okay, relax, relax. And they got to one kid from Montreal, I forget his name. I think it was Jackie something. And I got to him, and I smelled something that smelled very, very bad. And I said, Jackie, what happened? So he says, I'm lying in shit. So I said, why? He said, you told me to lie here. And he lay there all night because I told him he didn't. I said, why didn't you move that far, this far? You told me to lie here.
For many Canadians, Bashit became an unforgettable name. There, in that small Arab town, they first came under fire.
Sid Bube was beside me, and he'd fired several shots from the same position, and I asked him to move or they'd get a bead on him. And no, he didn't want to move, but so finally he stood up with a bullet in his head, and I had to pull him down, and we got him out of there.
Sid Cadloff from Montreal was lying there with his feet spread apart. Now, he got a machine gun burst, and he lost his leg, and that was the first action we took him out. So that was Sid Bube and Sid Cadloff, both got it in that first action.
There was another guy called Sid Rubinoff, something like that, who got hit.
By the way, Sid became a very bad name later on because all our Sids were getting hit. And I think they went to the rabbi and had their names changed to something else.
Sid Halperin was the fourth Canadian wounded. With a bullet in his knee, He was moved to a makeshift hospital. There he was told that, unfortunately, there was no anesthetic for the operation.
So he said, it's going to hurt. I knew it hurt. So I said, would you have any brandy? So he had a bottle of brandy. He gave me a whole glassful. I drank a whole glass of one gulp, and he operated. I was, well, not screaming. I was in pain. I was, oh, God, Jesus Christ. Finally, the doctor stops, and he says, are you Jewish?
The spirit was very high at the time. People were very excited because this was the first time that we were able to put together a fighting force that could protect the Jewish nation, the new Jewish nation.
Although spirits were high, problems remained. The Canadians found themselves in a strange land. Only a handful spoke Hebrew. Weapons were scarce, and training was to be the battleground itself.
We were trained for about no more than 10 days, and by that time we were considered to be well-trained. By the standards of those days, we were well-trained.
And the weapons were also rather new to us, particularly new ones that had just arrived from Czechoslovakia. Until then, most of us, until a day or two before, had never seen the weapons, let alone train on them.
And then we started to teach them the machine gun. And after 2 days, the one who could take it apart and put it together again, the best, with his eyes closed, eyes blindfolded, he was a machine gunner. And he got 5 bullets to shoot, and that was it. And he was a full-trained machine gunner after 5 bullets.
Probably we're the only artillery piece who, from the same position, managed to fight 3 different armies at the same time. For in the morning, we would be used against the Lebanese forces. At noontime, we'd be used against the Syrian forces. In the afternoon, we'd train our guns on the Jordanian forces.
And because I was rather cunning about the way I used to do things, I always decided that if I could, I would always have 2 gun positions, one which was a real position and one which was a dummy. And the dummy one would be the one where people would do their eating, and if they wanted to go to the loo, it would be from the dummy position. So all tracks, any aerial photography which was being made, would show the dummy position as being the real one, as an active live position. And I constructed dummy guns, and if any visitors ever came anywhere near, they were always not allowed to get to the dummy position, but close enough to see it, but not to it, and never, ever allow anyone anywhere near the real position. And one day during a truce, the United Nations came on a visit to inspect what was happening in our area and tried to get onto the gun position, and I didn't allow them to get onto the dummy gun position. And I refused to allow them, and I was very vehement about not allowing them to get near the dummy position. In other words, to reinforce in their minds that the dummy position was a real position. Anyway, after a short while of argument and discussion, they left. And within a half an hour or so of them leaving, when the truce was broken, the dummy gun position was being fired on by Jordanian artillery and mortars. In other words, somebody amongst the United Nations party had given away our position to the Jordanians very, very quickly. About that, there was not the slightest shadow of a doubt.
When Ben Dunkelman first arrived, he met Ben-Gurion to propose a plan for an English-speaking unit. But after the Canadian action at Bashit, Ben-Gurion decided against it. He feared major casualties would have an impact on the morale in their country of origin. The Canadian platoon was disbanded and volunteers reassigned to new units throughout the Israeli forces. Lionel Drucker was sent to the armored unit, consisting of homemade armored trucks fashioned from plywood and sheet steel over standard truck frames. Eventually they acquired a real tank.
The first tank in the Israel Army, I remember it well. I was given the tank, and it was a Sherman without a gun, more or less put together from scrap that they had picked up. But eventually they decided to put a gun in this tank, and the only one that they had available was a Hispano-Suiza 20-millimeter gun, which you had to get out of the tank to fire. It was very, very impractical, of course, and not very useful.
Despite the makeshift approach, the Israelis were rapidly consolidating their forces. The Air Force was now in place. not only to fly supplies, but ready to fight. But the B-17s, which had been stripped of all military hardware after the Second World War, had to be retrofitted from various sources and remained untested.
Now, we knew that we might have trouble with the system that releases the bombs, because this was also put together very hastily. We had developed a system where we would have in the bomb bay an armorer ready to kick the bombs out in case the system did not work.
So this guy had to be very brave. He had to straddle the open space on 2 bars and hold on, so that as he moved along to kick out the bombs, he was one little slip and he'd been right through going with the bombs himself.
An Egyptian plane and Tel Aviv is bombed.
The Egyptians had been bombing Tel Aviv with impunity, with fighter airplanes, Dakotas, and there were some severe casualties in Tel Aviv from this bombing. And the whole main purpose of this flight, to bomb Cairo, the center of Cairo, and in this case, Farouk's palace being the aiming point, was to give an answer to the Egyptians that if you want to bomb Tel Aviv, you're going to get Cairo bombed. So in the final outcome of the bomb run, we had 12 bombs. 4 bombs fell right before the palace. And because of the delay in kicking, 8 bombs fell after the palace. So we did not actually hit the palace, but it was all around the palace, and the rest of the bombs went into the center of Cairo.
The bombing failed, but the message to Egypt was clear. Tel Aviv was never bombed again, but the country remained under siege.
Hundreds of colonies were cut off. Jerusalem was cut off. The country formed islands of defense.
The Arab plan was to isolate every Jewish settlement and cut off the vital arteries that carried food, water, and ammunition. Jerusalem was under siege. Without supplies and without arms, the weakened population had no hope.
So the situation was getting desperate. We were slowly eating up the supplies. Now, if Jerusalem didn't have supplies, and if it was to be cut off, I guess it would have been the end of the war.
For Jerusalem to survive, Israeli convoys needed to penetrate Arab lines to deliver desperately needed supplies. But the treacherously narrow, winding road to the city was under Arab control. The significance of the fall of Jerusalem was not lost on David Ben-Gurion.
Ben-Gurion led the convoy. He actually, when there was some argument among the troops as to whether they should go or not, said, "Follow me," and led the convoy into Jerusalem.
Despite the siege, the city held out. Withstanding bombings, shortages of food, water, and fuel, the population endured. Breaking the siege galvanized Jewish efforts throughout the countryside, and it was the turning point in the war. Ben Dunkelman was now called upon to lead the capture of the North. As the new commander of the 7th Brigade, he faced unforeseen problems.
I had a very high-ranking officer in my brigade headquarters who I suspected of being a spy. And when we formulated the attack on any place, I would keep him entirely in the dark. Would give him other orders so he'd know wouldn't know what we're doing.
In the north, the Druze minority fought alongside the Arabs against the Jews. But Dunkelman slipped across the lines at night to negotiate. The Druze would let the 7th Brigade into the fortified village. In return, they would not be harmed. All gunfire was to be theatrical, harmless shots into the air. Now all Dunkelman had to contend with was an enemy within his own ranks.
This chap took my orders later from one of the battalion, turned it all around and had them attacking, and all the artillery fire, what little fire we had, on the Drew section. I suspected something like this would happen, and I checked with the artillery and found out what was happening, and I changed the orders. So he was definitely, I had the definite proof that he was a traitor. He should have been executed for what he did. I mean, we could have lost. As a result of this order, we could have failed in our conquest of the entire Galilee, particularly the assault on Nazareth.
The campaign in the north was an unqualified success. Under Dunkelman's command, the 7th Brigade, formerly notorious for high casualties, captured the Galilee with only 3 losses. Ben-Gurion, impressed with Dunkelman's leadership, hoped to repeat the successful formula throughout the rest of the Israeli forces.
I had told Ben-Gurion in no uncertain terms that he really better get tough with his top officers if he wanted some discipline and some action.
What Ben-Gurion really wanted was an integrated army, and this meant disbanding the Palmach, the elite unit of the Haganah. The Palmach, arising from the kibbutz movement, was ideological, non-conforming, and in Ben-Gurion's eyes, a potential threat to the unity of the army. Through insignia, badges of rank, and the more established trappings of military order, Dunkelman reorganized the Palmach. Another political faction with its own private army was the Irgun. Led by Menachem Begin, it had a long history of differences with the Haganah. The arrival of the Altalena was to bring these differences sharply into focus.
The beach at Tel Aviv becomes a battlefield. In the first serious breach in the new Israeli nation, Irgun extremists clashed with the government over a shipload of ammunition.
The Altalena brought with it a large supply of guns, ammunition, and hundreds of trained volunteers.
Israeli soldiers fire on the ship and its much-needed cargo. Brother fights brother in the confusion of skirmish along the bloody beach.
But the bulk were survivors coming either from the partisans in the forests of Eastern Europe or survivors of the concentration camps of the Nazis.
Well, of course, it was very difficult, the whole concept that a Jewish officers and a Jewish ship and a Jewish crew would be used to fight other Jews on a ship whose purpose was very similar to what our purpose was, and that was to defend a new state and to create a viable country.
They claimed in those days that it was a coup d'etat, that the Irgun wanted to take over the government also, which was really a fabrication from the beginning to the end. We knew, all of us, that we are coming to join forces with the army to fight against the Arabs. Our weapons were in grease, in oil, in cases. We couldn't use them to start a war or to take over or to do what they call a revolt against the government.
If Ben-Gurion had allowed the Irgun to proceed with that time, we'd have had a separate army of Palmach, which was very left. We'd have had a separate army of the right, of the Irgun, and we'd have had an army of the middle, which would have represented 80% of the population. And we'd have had civil war ever since. Ben-Gurion stopped that.
That burning ship in Tel Aviv harbor has a cargo of munitions which may explode at any moment.
The Altalena and its volatile cargo reached Israel during a UN truce. Ben-Gurion prepared to strike a final blow to the Irgun, which he felt would be beyond control with such a vast arsenal. As unloading was underway, the Palmach opened fire. In desperation, the Altalena put back to sea, only to be cut off by the Wedgewood, a Haganah destroyer.
There was some shooting from the shore coming towards us. So we assumed that the people on the ship were shooting at us. We returned the fire.
When the shooting started, I noticed the bullets over my head on the steel bulkhead bouncing off the thing. And I looked up at our captain. Kippy, and I said to him, what'll we do, Kippy? He says, well, return the fire. If they're shooting at you, return the fire. So I returned the fire onto the ship.
The resulting tragedy of errors was devastating for the volunteers aboard the Altalena, caught in the political and terrifyingly real crossfire.
People aboard are in imminent peril, so there's haste to get off, leaping into the water to swim to the nearby shore. They swarm down to escape the blast, which is sure to come.
We tried to get ashore with small boats. They shot at the small boats, and we could see that there was gunfire on the shore between the various factions and all.
The Altalena was in flames, and for a short time the new state was on the brink of civil war.
The munition ship aground at Tel Aviv. It erupts with a series of explosions.
I was heartbroken, and I started to cry. I cried, sobbed like a baby. I cried for hours.
We really didn't know what happened. I found out what happened long afterwards. I found out that the shooting was not from the people on the Altalena at us. It was from the Army coming down to attack them.
Many years later, I met Jack Blank, who was in charge of the guns on the Altalena. He was a Toronto boy. And Jack told me that I'd open fire on him first. And I said, you open fire on me first. And that's when we realized suddenly that the bullets had come from the beach, from our own men.
After things happen, you know, a lot of politicians will say different things to justify what happened. But I tell you, from all indications, nobody knew what they were doing. And it was birth pains, again, of a new nation.
It was an independence won at a great cost. 6,000 Israeli deaths, nearly 1% of the population. Many of the Mahal, the foreign volunteers, gave their lives for the new country. They're now remembered as brothers in arms, who refused to let a young nation stand alone as it struggled into being.
We got a lot more out of this than they could ever give us. We got out of it ourselves. This was our sense of achievement. Perhaps in history, 100 years from today, they'll mention the volunteers that turned the tide, and we did turn the tide.
This is an emotional act. You don't even consider whether you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing, because you are motivated by something much more powerful than you are.
It was the biggest thing in my life. If I had it to do all over again, I would do the same thing, only more, somehow. I think it was the most beautiful thing I could ever do as a Jew. I'm not religious. I don't believe, but I'm a Jew. And I helped the Jewish people, what was left of them in Europe. And damn, I'm proud of myself.